let's take the preceding exercise as some sort of warm-up, and now let's discuss in more depth what is human experiments and when to actually use them. So our objective, or the objective whenever we use such methods, is to analyze measurable effects in the human application of methods, approaches, or techniques. So it's always some effect with some human doing something. Now, that's basically the human experimentation aspect. It has some strengths and weaknesses, and the strengths are there's a pretty clear quantification of cause-effect relationships. So first of all, it's quantifying, and we can study cause-effect relationships, especially differentiate between whether they are there or not, and also differentiate relative to, for example, chance occurrences. So this quantified basis and the cause-effect relationships, that's typically the key motivation to do such experiments. As a result, statistic analysis and the possibility to draw conclusions is possible. So we have a sound basis, and it can often be replicated if it's appropriately packaged, as we will discuss later. And some of the most important experiments are also indeed replicated in rather different settings, achieving a very good understanding and also making us pretty confident in the correctness of the conclusion. On the other hand, there are definitely certain weaknesses that have to be taken into account when this method is to be selected. So we do experiment in laboratory settings. Yeah, that's just what the basic idea is. We create an artificial environment, an artificial setting in which an experiment runs. And of course, that can influence how people behave, leading to results that may be different from what would be expected, or which I could observe in a different context. In general, replication with the same subjects is not possible. The reason is simply learning effects. You can control for them to some extent, but not fully. Also, expectation biases and other issues may negatively influence how people deal with the situation and the kind of results that they show. There's also pretty high effort for the measurement and for the control of the execution. And by and large, doing a controlled experiment is a lot of effort. So that has to be taken into account. It's definitely, in terms of the overall execution of such experiment, it's several work weeks, if not months, that may be needed. Controlled experiments are not the only kind of experiments. There are actually several types of experiments, and we can classify these kind of experimentations in different ways. The first would be by how we deal with the variables. In a controlled experiment, we change influencing variables by rather explicitly. So we have positive control and negative control. This is, or this basically means we select certain treatments. Just think about medical experiments. That's very similar to these kind of controlled experiments we are talking here about. A positive control would be we give a patient a certain medicine, and then we look for the effect. A negative control would be like a placebo. We give an alternative treatment, and also an effect will result, and then we can compare both. So that's fully controlled experiments. Then there are natural experiments. They are so-called quasi-experiments. Why? There we typically do not have such a strong possibility for exerting control. Yeah, there, for example, variations occur based on some natural factors, and we then only relate these kind of influences to the outcome. So it's basically nature is doing us the favor of doing an experiment. Like there are certain a number of different conditions, and then we simply observe the outcomes. And there's also field experiments that would be like real settings. Let's say you have a company and they initially used a certain method, and then after some time they switch to another method and they record the data that they get, the results, for example, on productivity or on defects. That actually would be a field experiment. You would have it in a real setting in a company, but a lot of stuff would be uncontrolled. That's part of the problem. So you would never be sure whether it's only the specific case that changed. We can also differentiate experiments by subjects. For example, as single group experiments or multi-group experiments, meaning do we have different groups of people which we make subject to the different conditions or not. Especially if we have a group that receives a treatment and the other basically a placebo, that's also often called a control group, to understand what would be the effect of nothing in comparison to the desirable treatment. And of course there are technical experiments, and there it would be completely different because that's basically with machines.